What are you making?
I'm mixing up a stew to give corporate a different view. Have a taste. Welcome to the Corporate Kitchen. I'm your host, Tiger, and today on the menu is Absolute Events. As we look to wrap up March and the first business quarter in 2025, the topic that I want to talk about today is events that change corporate America forever. We have seen plenty of these throughout history. Early, like hundreds of years ago, you had Ford come out with the 40-day work week. You had events like the Great Depression, stock market crashes, the creation of the stock market, the housing crisis in 2008, 2009. These events were a point in time in which afterwards, the way that we did corporate America changed. If you are a fan of animation, Marvel, DC, then I could recommend that you take a look at a couple things. In relation to Marvel, they have this series called What Ifs, and it's a good representation of what they would consider an absolute event. DC did this as well with a 3-part movie series of the Infinite Earths. They did a great job highlighting something that we're going to dive into, this whole idea of ultimate events. The most recent one that we're going to talk about specifically in this episode in relation to corporate America is the COVID-19 pandemic. So without further ado, let's start how we always do and look into the Merriam-Webster. For absolute events, there's 10 definitions for absolute, 5 for events. I won't do all 15, not going to bore you like that, so I'll just go direct. For absolute as a noun, we're using definition number 6 for fundamental, ultimate, and for event as a noun, there's only 5 definitions, but we're going to use 1B, which is a noteworthy happening. We put those together and we have fundamental, noteworthy happening. 2 things that we need to pry out that definition. One is this concept of fundamental. Regardless of the event that we consider or that we're going to classify as an absolute event, the net effect of it is a fundamental change. Regardless of how big the magnitude, the global economy that it affects, you can break it down and simplify it to a fundamental change that happens as a result of that event. The second part is not necessarily noteworthy, but it's the happening, meaning it's not a one and done thing. These absolute events are a catalyst to change, and the change is continuous and the change happens. One thing that we're going to talk about today in relation to COVID-19 is the number of companies that even today in 2025 would still place blame or causation on some of the issues they're having today from the pandemic period. Because these absolute events, although they change things for the future, it's not a one-time change. It's not a one-day change. It's a change over time. It's continuous, and people feel the effects of it on a larger economy scale. The change is fundamental that affects everyone. So it doesn't matter the industry, public sector, private sector, defense contractor, commercial group. It affects everyone. It's so fundamental that it is just a net effect across the board. And some people will embrace it. Some people will resist it. But it's a fundamental change that's going to happen. Again, we're going to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic as the specific recent example to drive this point home. Can't use the Merriam-Webster to talk about COVID-19, so we're going to have to consult an alternative source to talk about it. So according to the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the COVID-19 or coronavirus disease 2019 is a disease caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It most often causes respiratory symptoms that can feel much like a flu, cold, or pneumonia. A key date in this timeline of the pandemic is March 13th, 2020 when the Trump administration declared a nationwide emergency and issued a travel ban. A lot of additional actions in March 2020 led to the transition to a corporate-wide work from home classification. I want to use the COVID-19 pandemic as the specific example. Number one, because it's the most recent, but number two, it helps break down the fundamental change that we're going to go over because a lot of people went through it. I think more people in the audience listening to this podcast went through that than if I went, all the way back to the 60s or 70s. So most recent on our mind, we can all relate to it. But the fundamental change in that is the reclassification of work location. There were some jobs before the pandemic that were always done remote, that was always done in office. But after this, during and after this event, it started to change. It started to be questioned. This started reclassification, and it's something that needed to be addressed. And now we have this fundamental shift of where does work site location mean and make sense? Do we need to come into the office every day? Do we need to work remote? I know from a employee standpoint, a lot of people enjoy the opportunity to work from home because they were able to balance the work life a lot more. Employers, some embraced it, some resisted it, and some, as it continues to happen today, are adapting and changing their stance on previously supporting and now resisting a little bit more, or previously resisted and now embracing it a little bit more. It's a big fundamental change that really affected the world. And that's the first takeaway, is change is very, very hard. Change management is even harder. It's one thing to change something. It's another to have to manage that change. And one thing that we do have to consider is these absolute events are a good catalyst to change, but someone has to manage that change process. You're an employee. I'm assuming listening to this, you're not the CEO of the company. So you're waiting to hear the flowdown from your president, CEO, the highest ranking member of the company on how this change is going to be managed. As I mentioned from the excerpt of the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, that it was a administrative order that declared a nationwide emergency and the travel ban. That adds a level of complexity when you're also trying to be in compliance to regulatory concerns. So it's one thing to be a CEO and a president, and you're trying to perform change management on a change that was within the bounds of your company. It's another where there are external influences on that change management as well. And it just increases the complexity, right? So the first takeaway, change is hard. Change management is harder. If you're an employee, kind of help out where you can, and also just understand the perspective that change managers have. You yourself are also a change manager too, because once you get the flow down from leadership of here's how we're going to manage the change, you now have to become a change manager yourself in your own life and address the input that you receive from the company in order to output your change management strategy. And that is so hard. It really is. It's like the air fryer. The air fryer became a thing in 2010, really, and it's spiked up in popularity. Spiked up. It's one of those things that when you heard about it originally, we're all used to, as Americans, we're all used to greasy food. Cook my fried chicken in Crisco, right? And now people are saying, no, greaseless frying. And you're like, huh? Why would that's a change that, where's my oil? Where's the taste? It won't have the taste. It won't have the texture. I'm not going to embrace this change. But then You managed it. Some people bought an air fryer. Some people waited to taste what an air fryer could produce from others before deciding to purchase one. And at this point, I mean, they're so large that it wouldn't be a stretch to say, you as a listener, I would probably say more than 50% of you have an air fryer because we've all managed that change and now adapted to what the new normal is for cooking. They even have instructions on stuff like pizza rolls and other, you know, stuff that you would just put type of food that you would just put in the microwave or oven. There are air fryer instructions on those packages now. Total change to the baseline of what would be the mythology of cooking frozen foods. You would have the microwave or the oven. Now you have a third option. It totally revolutionized the way that you cook and, I mean, even now, reheat meals. So as we walk back into the corporate office with the COVID-19 pandemic, the change was a lot of work from home. It was embraced from a legal requirement, but also from a world requirement. I mean, we were in a healthcare crisis. So a lot of people and a lot of companies embraced it to address the current situation at hand. Fast forward to today, and we're still trying to, and there are a lot of companies that are still trying to navigate that change and either identify a return to office plan, a hybrid plan, or a work remote plan. Tiger's personal recommendation, if you want my opinion in the matter, I think hybrid is the way. In my opinion, hybrid is the way. There should be a good mix of working flexible location wise and a requirement for collaboration, seeing people in office. There's just some things that are too difficult to do when everyone's remote, some things that don't require you to be in office as well. Mind you, and that's not across the board. It's a fundamental change, right? So again, as we talk about in a lot of episodes, things are on a spectrum and there's a threshold to break into each side. So I think as a normal business operating procedure, hybrid. But if you are in a industry or a field, like for example, oil rigging, you can't do oil rigging remote. You got to be on the oil rig. So obviously that is something that's past the threshold you got to be in office for. If you're in a manufacturing company, can't build it from home, you're past the threshold, you got to be in office. If you're call center or if you're a help desk, to me, that sounds like something that's on the threshold of that's probably could be 100% remote, right? But from a basic business operating procedure, my Tiger's opinion, hybrid's the way. Hybrid should be the way. The bigger point that I want to bring up, though, and this is takeaway number 2, is we can adapt. And we've shown that. I need to take a second and say that to all the small businesses that we lost, I'm sorry that you went out of business. I know it was definitely hard to go through that period of time during the pandemic, and a lot of people lost their businesses. The takeaway, though, is for everyone else, though, and even for the people that lost their businesses, we can adapt. We can adapt, and we've shown our resilience as human beings to be able to take a change in, absorb it, and still successfully produce an output that's happy for us. I think the universal standard that we understand are corporations, especially public corporations, are in it for the shareholders. You have to look out for yourself. And when we do that, you really are able to unlock levels of your mind and your abilities that previously weren't touched to be able to adapt to the changes that are coming or the changes that are actively happening. This is part of the resiliency and self-preservation that we have as human beings. It's an awesome quality to have. I mean, we will survive at the end of the day. And the push to want to do more, or the push in self-preservation, helps propel us to do the things that we need to do to take care of ourselves. You are a great change manager, whether you want to believe that or not. You're here, and especially if you're listening to this, you know that you have the ability to take in information and make the change for the better. When we went home during the pandemic, companies had to adapt. And I haven't done the research. I will do it, but the number of millionaires that were created from the pandemic because of the people that invested on companies during their low point, and now people are flourishing, companies are flourishing, it has to be much larger than on any normal year. One thing that's true about majority of absolute events is there's usually a response by the market that's negative, meaning there is a drop in the market. That makes sense naturally because initial responses to any change is usually negative, right? When we hear about changes, if they change the college football playoff format, they change rules in the NFL. I mean, the first reaction is always like, "Oh, I'm not interested. This is something that now I have to learn, and it's not voluntary," right? So people tend to have that first roadblock of trying to get to acceptance of the situation. We're going to deny it and get to acceptance, but it's kind of hard to deny once they announce it. It's like, here it is. All right, cool. It's here. Now let's get to acceptance. But remember, you can adapt, and you did. A lot of you work from home, and now you either still work from home or you got back into the office. The thing is, we are all at different ages, and that is critical to how we manage our change. What does that mean? That means when we talk about the COVID-19 pandemic and the classification of workers as being mostly remote, except for critical jobs that couldn't be remote, doctors, etc. That was a change for a lot of us. But that was also the start of careers for a lot of people. There were Gen Zers that graduated college that didn't have, a formal graduation because you couldn't gather that many people in one spot, and they entered the workforce in a remote setting. And that's all they know. So their foundation, the fundamental ideal of what work is and where you work and how you work, is remote. Now being brought back into the office or being called into the office, their whole mind and boat is rocked because how they laid their fundamental foundation is being cracked. Whereas for us, we had a fundamental foundation of being in the office every day. So being asked to work from home didn't rock that foundation. We already had a foundation there, and it was established for a while. So it just provided a new structure to put on there. Being called back into the office now, our foundation was working in the office. So our foundation's not rocked. We're good. We created this new structure to be able to work from home. Okay, we can't use it anymore, or we use it less often. Cool. We're good. Structure was there. Going back. There are people whose foundation was working remote. Now they're being asked to come back into the office, and the perspective is the fundamental foundation that they created is totally being destroyed. If you're listening to that and you're one of those people, take a step back and breathe. Take a step back and breathe. Because at the end of the day, what we have to understand is that these absolute events are a happening, like we said in the definition. Where we stand today, even after the event, is not necessarily going to hold true for the future. You got to be open to embracing change. You got to be open to being a change manager so that You're not resistant to the happening, and you're more so trying to adapt and take care of yourself and get back to a thriving nature in the situation that you're in. If you are one of those people that set up your life for remote and you just feel like you can't come into the office and the company is asking everyone to return back into the office full time, then obviously, you have choices to make on what you're going to do and how you're going to proceed. But it's not the end of the world. There will be additional events that will have fundamental changes on this level. The COVID-19 pandemic was a fundamental change to where you worked, the classification of work. You had back then, the Ford company 40-hour work week, fundamental change to working hours. You had the introduction of a 401k, fundamental change to retirement planning. You had the formation of unions, fundamental change to working groups, salaried versus union, exempt versus non-exempt. The introduction of the railroad, fundamental change to logistics. Things that would take months or even years to transport are now taking shorter amount of times. Introduction to airplanes, another fundamental change in logistics and how we move people and the speed in which we move people in. I can keep going and going and going. With all those examples, they're fundamental changes, which means they're foundational changes. How you address them shouldn't fracture where you learned, right? As I mentioned before, a lot of us, 5 days in the office every single day, our foundation is being in the office. Asking to be home doesn't break that. That's what we fundamentally understood. Now it's being changed. Does that mean I destroy my foundation and restart it? No, the foundation was already laid. So now I just need to add a layer or a structure on top of it to say, here's what I understood. I'm not going to lose that knowledge. You lose that knowledge. That is your experience. You hold that strong, and then you build upon that. It was a flat slab of concrete. Now I get to work from home. It's now a basement. I didn't destroy my foundation, just built upon it, built a structure. It's now a basement. Or I always worked remote. It was a basement before. Now I got to work in office, so I just filled it up. Now it's a slab. So you're not destroying your foundation. You're just evolving it. If you think about commercial air travel, there are people, and I had a coworker recently and that I learned this about, that have never flown. Over 30 years old, never flown a day in their life, super nervous too. And it's 2025 at this point. Flying seems so normal, so fundamental that you can forget that it's still a spectrum. There are people that fly every single day, like I believe it's the new Starbucks CEO that's going to be flying between the state of Washington and the state of California on the corporate jet to get to their meetings, to the other side of the spectrum of the colleague I just mentioned, over 30 years old, never been on a flight. Never. And then all of us in between fly a lot, fly a little, but normalize flying because it's a fundamental thing. Now, if you're that colleague that's never flown before, and now you have to fly, does that destroy your foundation? No. It's just a fundamental change. It exists. We knew it exists, and we're going to adapt to make things happen. The reason that this colleague had to fly was for something that could not be missed, something that could not have been delayed, something that could not have been late to. The drive would have taken a lot more time and taken away from the ability to support that event correctly. If you are an adult, you're going to pick up pretty much what this event is. Couldn't miss the event. Could not miss the event. Had to get there on time. Had to get there quickly. The only option to do that was to fly. And this colleague did take their first flight It was successful. And this colleague is okay. Not necessarily open to flying every day now, but had that experience. And did it destroy this colleague's total foundation on what flying is and that no one should fly? No. Went through the experience, made the adjustment. Okay, I have adapt. Now I understand what flying is. I could do this. And that's what I want you to understand. You can do this. When we go back into the kitchen and we talk about the air fryer, when you first heard about air frying, what was the first thing you tasted from the air fryer? Did you go all the way to the extreme and say, hey, I'm going to try fried chicken out the air fryer? Probably not. Most of you probably tried something that was an easier grab, a smaller risk, French fries, pizza rolls, or something quick like that that helps introduce the idea to you, doesn't rock the whole boat, doesn't destroy your foundation of everything you thought about when it comes to frying food. You went with something small, French fries. Okay, let's give those a try. Oh, okay, tasted it. Now I have gained knowledge and absorbed what air frying's all about. And now I can embrace the change a little bit. Okay, I understand. Now I'm going to adapt and try to see what this is about. Or maybe you said, nah, I tried it, got the experience, inputted that knowledge, and I'm just going to decide, nope, that's not for me. Regardless, on a fundamental level, regardless of what you as an individual decides, on a larger picture, it fundamentally changed the world. So the world is going to adapt. You're going to have more companies that make these frozen foods with wrappers that have instructions on how to cook it in an air fryer. What does that mean for you as an individual? Well, going back to what I said earlier, you just have to become a change manager. The president, the CEO, the people that are in charge of a larger number of constituents have a perceived higher responsibility because they're going to set the stage for everyone else and kind of lead while we follow. But that doesn't make them the sole change manager. You also have to manage the change. When KitchenAids were introduced, there are mixers already. There are products that do the same job. KitchenAid kind of revolutionized the standard for mixing. Did you have to embrace it? No, but adapting to it opened the ability to see that things can be done differently. And at that point, you have to be a change manager yourself. And it's like, okay, am I going to endorse KitchenAid and try all the different attachments that it has in order to have a one-stop shop? Or do I keep the other utensils that I have? Either's correct. It's whatever helps you to thrive as an individual. And that's going to take me to my last takeaway. Education is so important. When we talked about mentoring in one of the first couple episodes of this podcast, I mentioned that talking to more tenured people is a blessing. And it's really, I didn't use the term blessing, but it is a great thing that you should really do. You should not shy away from talking to more tenured people with a little bit more seasoning. And as we look into this topic of absolute points, they are the best resource for managing this change because they've been through multiple absolute events. If you're someone that started your life with remote work after the pandemic, you haven't really experienced anything. And it's not because, you're young and once you hit 50, then you went through experiences that the world changes unrelated to your age, unrelated to time. There could be 5 absolute events in a year, or there could be 1, or there could be none. So it's not necessarily a thing of, hey, when I get older, I'm going to experience more of these. Yes and no. The frequency that it happens, it is variable. The point is, those seasoned people that have aged like fine wine have been through more than what you have. I mean, that's just fact. Whether it's 2 more, 1 more, 20 more. They have been through more of these events than you have. Getting the education from them is critical because history repeats itself all the time, and you want to be prepared for the next one. So it's great, in my opinion, to have these conversations with some of these more seasoned people and understand what the change was like. I remember back in high school, and I'm not going to go too much into the story because that's for Thursday, but my teacher was alive before the first computer was like really introduced. I mean, live, like mainstream. And this teacher taught computers her whole career, and the math wasn't mathing. And I was like, wait, computers haven't been out that long. Pretty cool experience of learning from an individual that went from typewriter to what we have for computers now, just teaching computer classes. History, those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. Know your history and talk to these people. Talk to a lot of different people who have been through a lot of points in history and ask them questions. Understand how they navigated it, how they were a change manager to them. There is so much tribal knowledge that exists. Not just tribal, when people use the term tribal knowledge, it's always in relation to the work, always in relation to the processes that happen. But they also hold a lot of tribal knowledge in how they manage the changes that happened from absolute events. When the world went from pensions to 401ks, there were a lot of decisions that had to be made at that time with retirement planning. People had to consult other financial experts to figure out what to do. Those conversations that were had, the help that they sought, the type of finance experts they reach out to is good knowledge for you to be able to do your own planning. And better yet, help you understand why the 401k was introduced and help prepare you to think, okay, the 401k is now. What could possibly be the future? And if it were to change from 401k to something else, how do I prepare for that or make sure that when it's happening, I know who to consult, I know what to do, and it's just better to be prepared. You want to be prepared for the unknown. You want to be prepared for the unexpected and not end up as the results of the causation and just perform due to the causation. I'll say that again. You don't want to be the result of. You don't want to be the product of a causation. You want to produce because of the causation. Get in front of it, know what to do. If they change 401ks and they made and I'm just going to make something up, like they made a new thing called like Retirement Plan 1, and that's just what it was. You already know, okay, I'm ahead of the game. That's what they're going to change it to. I'll take a read of it. I'll see if I'm going to invest in it, but I know I have to take steps 1 through 6 to address this. I don't know how it's going to get fully addressed. I just know the what. I'll consult the individuals that I need to consult so that we can really figure this out and figure out what the how is. But I'm not going to just stand there with a blank face and be like, oh, I have no idea what to do or where to even start. So embrace the older generation. They know a lot. They do know a lot. And although their perspectives can be a little too very, very much biased, you just have to know that going into that conversation that, hey, they hold a lot of bias in this area. Therefore, I can't take this more than a grain of sand on the situation. Or they don't hold a lot of bias. I value their opinion, and what they say means a lot. Regardless, it's not Bible because that's what they went through. You're going to go through something different based off of your situation. It's just good information to know. So as we wrap up, just know absolute events are going to happen. They are going to happen. The change that it creates is hard. Managing that change is much harder. You can wait to hear the flow down from your leadership of how the company is managing a change. But remember, at some point, you're going to have to be a change manager. So just be prepared for that and try to get in front of it as much as possible. 2 things to know. about you being a change manager, which is our takeaways 2 and 3, to you can adapt. You have the ability to adapt. Don't feel as though, unless you like have a disability or something that like physically or mentally restricts you from being able to do it. In general, as human beings, you can adapt. You can get better. Think about the entire journey that you've taken to get to this spot right now to listen to this podcast. You've been through a lot. You've changed a lot. You have the ability to do whatever you need to do to succeed. And 2, in being this change manager, which was our third takeaway, education. Education is so important. Whatever you can do to increase your education. I mentioned going to the more seasoned people so that you can get a person-to-person perspective. You can also learn it from books, right? The book is your best mentor. You can definitely do that. And a lot of people have written books about history and about how things happen and how the world reacted. So you can definitely get it from a book too. But don't shy away from the people-to-people interaction. They lived through it. They'll be able to tell you how they lived and how they succeeded. Because at the end of the day, what is this about? We want you thriving. Just please don't put like a pork butt in the air fryer though. The air fryer isn't made for everything. Other than that, thrive away. And with that, we'll turn off this stove, take off the thinking apron, and let's just say the dishes will get done later. This topic wasn't a big mess, but if we learned something today, then we know there's a little cleaning up to do. I do want to talk this topic more, maybe trade stories about this soon, like this Thursday soon. I hope to see you there. Thanks for being in the corporate kitchen today. I'm your host, Tiger. Until next time.